This is similar to the question of if you have an infinite amount of monkeys writing on an infinite amount of typewriters, would eventually one of the monkeys rewrite all of Shakespeare's work?
Except all three premises of that scenario is wrong.
So I could say that we just live in a simulation, and I don't think that's equally impossible to prove wrong, basically.
We're the Existence Project, and we try to have respectful, loving conversations. What do you think?
Which God are you talking about?
Sorry?
Which God are you talking about?
We're talking about, I guess, the initial cause of all causes. We present various evidences for the existence of God by first saying that when we talk about proof for God, if we're talking about an entity that started time and space and matter, that entity has to be outside of time, space, and matter necessarily. We're saying that as you go back in this chain of events, there has to be an initial chain or initial cause. And we're saying that that cause is fundamentally creative and intentional because of the creativity and the intention and the purpose that we see in the universe around us.
So does your argument not contradict itself? Because then I could just ask you, who created God?
I love that question. And I think it's a very fair question. If we're talking about a contingency of events, why stop at God? Very simply, because atheists generally, and in philosophy, the alternative to God that is presented rationally is that there is an infinite regress of asking this question. And we can continue going asking, but that is an infinity. You ask a question of where a thing came from according to its attributes. For example, I often quote that, if the baker baked the bread, who baked the baker? Nobody ever asks that. It's a crazy question. Because the baker is fundamentally different than the bread. So we ask a question about the baker according to his attributes, his characteristics, what it is. So when God is by definition infinite, then on one side, philosophically, atheists are proposing an infinity, an infinite regress. But if you come to an infinite being, then you don't ask where it started, because that is self-contradictory. So we're replacing one infinity with another, so it's the exact same equivocation. However, this infinity of God makes sense because you cannot have B, C, D, E, F if you do not have A, if it is a contingent event. We're saying God is that initial impetus, and that he is by definition infinite.
So could you not say that you're creating a narrative to suit your definition?
I would be creating a narrative to fit my own definition if the narrative did not fit the narrative of what we see around us. If I'm proposing a God that runs contrary to human rationality, then I'm doing what you're doing. If I'm proposing a God that runs contrary to our scientific understanding of the universe, then, however, I'm proposing a God that firstly was proposed by people of all ages, of all times, and all lands, even as far back as 40,000 years ago in the Aborigines of Australia, and saying that it is an interesting case study that all of the most honest, truthful, righteous, pious people in every society pointed to one God. I would say it's actually the atheist perspective that is trying to concoct a version to fit its own agenda, not the belief, the perspective of belief.
Yeah. Okay, so from an atheist perspective, someone would believe from a scientific understanding that everything came about from just complete randomness, and therefore you don't need a rational explanation for anything. It's someone that believes in God who would seek a rational and moral explanation. So then, since you believe in God, I would have to ask you as well, why, if God exists, why does everything else exist then?
If God exists, why does everything else exist?
Yeah. Like, why would God choose to create this entire universe?
So, two questions. I'll go with the first one about it coming from randomness. And why do I say that, it should come from an intelligent force? And actually, the fact is that we operate in life by trying to always see why things are the way they are. Science has played a pivotal and irreplaceable role in the acquisition of truth of the physical realm of the universe. I have no doubt when it comes to believing that this was all random, it actually is fundamentally way more improbable. There are people like Rogers Penrose and so many other of the greatest mathematicians who have actually crunched the numbers to see just how improbable it was for this universe to happen by chance. So why would you wager on the lowest conceivable probability rather than on what we have observed throughout our lives, that when there is design and purpose, there has to be a mind behind it?
I would say that you can't use the argument of how improbable something is, because we are living proof that no matter how improbable the outcome was, we are in the outcome anyway. So
And what I mean about that probability is that to believe that it happened completely on its own is that extremely improbable number. But to believe that if there is design, it was designed. But for example, let's say that there was a random word generator. That word generator can generate up to 1 trillion words, and it randomly generates every single piece of literature ever written in the order, chronology in which it was written. You would be absurd to say, well, there was a chance. There was a chance that it could have happened, therefore it happened. No, it happened because somebody typed up those words. It's impossible that all of the literature would have come. Or that if a printing press exploded and all of William Shakespeare's works came out perfectly, and I said, oh, well, that was just the off chance and it happened. No, you'd be like, no, that's absolutely impossible. But what we would conclude is that somebody wrote those things.
But this is similar to the question of if you have an infinite amount of monkeys writing on an infinite amount of typewriters, would eventually one of the monkeys rewrite all of Shakespeare's work? And because you have infinite of them, I would say that you're guaranteed, given an infinite amount of time, you're guaranteed for them to write up everything, rewrite everything.
I agree.
So with the universe, because with the atheist belief, it's been around since before time, which means that I would assume that's an infinite amount of time. So given an infinite amount of time, you're provided an infinite amount of possibilities. So you're pretty much guaranteed that something will come about eventually.
I agree with you. I totally agree with you that if there was an infinite amount of time and there was an infinite amount of monkeys and they were just randomly typing away, then we were bound to come across some quantum version, right? Except all three premises of that scenario is wrong. Number one, there's not an infinite amount of time. We know that time began at the inception of the Big Bang. And so we have only had 13.8 billion years thus far. We're working within the universe that is tangible, observable, empirical, and measurable. So it's interesting, many atheist friends, they want to talk about what is measurable and empirical. And I say, if we're going to talk about this, if you're going to start postulating what was before the Big Bang, for which there's absolutely no empirical evidence, then you're becoming inconsistent in your own standard, with due respect. The second thing is, there are not an infinite amount of monkeys at all. You're putting in the factoring in an infinite number of monkeys. Firstly, monkeys are intelligent. The fact that you need, in every example I've ever heard that an atheist uses, including Richard Dawkins in when he first used this example, he always uses an intelligent entity that has a mind and a willfulness and has the ability to even crunch numbers. So we know what atheists are conceding in all of these examples implicitly is that it has to be an intelligent force to some extent or another. So neither has there been an infinite amount of time, and we know because of entropy the universe is bound for absolute heat death as well. So when there is no evidence at all for infinite time, and all of the examples always require an intelligence, then again we have to fall back to the fact that where there's design and function, there must need to be an intelligent creative force behind it. This only proves the case for believers.
I do see your point, but if we go back to the point where you said atheists are the blind believers, I would like to go back to that.
I didn't mean that in an offensive way. I said that atheism, after you look at these mathematical numbers and after they have heard both sides, which most atheists haven't, then I think it takes more blind belief. I don't mean that in a derogatory term.
I know that, but it's just that when you have a belief backed by science, I don't think it's fair to call it a blind belief because you're believing the things that are.
But disbelief in God is not backed by science at all. That's all I'm saying.
Disbelief in God.
Yeah, that's not backed by science. I've discussed in light of entropy, in light of probability. This is all science, and that's what I'm saying. It points to a creative, intelligent, fundamental initial cause.
So you would say that you believe in God because as of now, you don't have an answer for what created everything.
No, I do have an answer. The reason I have an answer is that there are levels to understanding this concept of God. One is a theoretical discussion that we are having. But in the end, not everyone is... Are you a university student or are you working?
Yeah, I'm a student, yeah.
Student, right? So not everyone even has the privilege to go to a Western university. There are kids even in third world countries, I've met them, and they don't have the privilege of being able to have a discussion like this because they're getting water for their families to survive. So if God exists, there has to be a way to ascertain him for every person. That's why every prophet of God has said, get to actually talk to God. pray and know through your observed experience, through the acceptance of prayer over and over again, that God exists. This is what we are out here talking about, that all the other discussions are theoretical. And I agree with you. Look, for example, you and I could debate here for the next 500 years. We would never be able to, through theory, prove to each other empirically that electromagnetism exists. We can't do it. Or that jealousy exists as a physical thing. As you go up the ladder of more and more powerful and fundamental forces, they become increasingly difficult and elusive to the physical, tangible, dark energy. You and I can talk and reference all the scientists in the world, but we can't touch dark energy. We can't prove it in the way that many classical atheists want us to. So how can it be that the force behind those forces can be known in that way? You have to have the right approach to know that dark energy. So I say that if you pray to God, you genuinely interact with God, and you experience observable, measurable, repeatable, that's the scientific method, and you see that over and over again, then you can at least say, okay, it seems like there's something there. And we're saying experience for yourself. Each person should know. That's what we're inviting everyone to do. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Conversation.
Yeah, no, I can't prove you wrong, essentially, in this case. I wouldn't be able to do that. But I would also posit in the same way, it's not possible to prove any other theory about the nature of the universe wrong. So I could say that we just live in a simulation that's sufficiently complicated to simulate, sentient life and something of this scale. And I don't think that's equally impossible to prove wrong, basically. That's how I would, that would be my answer, basically.
So I agree with you that to the burden of proof in many spheres of the conversation is with the believers, especially, to say that the version of God that we're positing is in fact the one that created the universe.
Yeah.
I fully agree with you. What is required to create a simulation? An intelligent mind. You know, the whole reason that we're presenting the simulation as a counter theory is because a simulation requires an intelligent mind that deliberately chooses specific things, codes certain things, creates languages, then creates matter, etc. So you can call it a simulation. So it actually demonstrates that these individuals concede, and we must concede. Look, we know that the Big Bang took place because we look at what's happening right now and we work backwards. Likewise, by inference, by deduction, we have to concede that that prime mover is intelligent and creative fundamentally. So you can call it a programmer and I can call it God, but at least we have that common denominator.
Sure.
Right? So I think that's really interesting. And then the question is really, can you communicate with it? And our argument is, how can it be that a person can code all of the language, let's call this a simulation, go along with what you said, but is not capable of communicating at all or interacting with its own creation?
No, so, it would be, 100%. Yeah, no, it would be.
That's why we're saying, look, if religion is true, religion says, look, talk to God. Talk to God and be like, God, if you're there, I need your help. I'm struggling with things in life.
Sure.
Come and help me. And then if through experience, which is as scientific as it gets, repeated experience, a person sees, yes, God is helping me. And it happens over enough series of times, then by the same logic that we apply to double-blind clinical trials, we accept that God exists. And that's all we're inviting people to. What do you think? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely some truth in that for sure. And, I have a friend who I speak to a ton about philosophy and, the nature of the universe, all that kind of stuff. And the way he puts it is essentially for him, God is just a word for kind of like almost the beginning. It doesn't strictly mean just like mystical thing in the sky that created everything. Like it can mean a lot of different things. But yeah, I guess like the other question I would have is, in my opinion, I don't think it necessarily needs to be an intelligent mind. It could also just be kind of how to put it, the conditions that would be required to birth the universe. So that could be like an infinite regress of like the big crunch going back forever. It could be something like that as well.
So the reason that this is paradoxical, rationally speaking, is that either it is totally random or it is a simulation. Why is it that the same atheists, not yourself, but for the sake of argument, the same atheists who present the idea of a simulation, and a lot of people nowadays are going toward a simulation, but they're leaning on simulation because they know that the workings and the networking and the fundamental forces that underpin our universe and the way that they interact and the probabilistic impossibility, mathematically speaking, near impossibility of everything panning out the way it is demands that it takes far less blind faith to say that there's some purpose behind it, there's some laws. So all we're saying is that there is a creative force behind the creativity that we see, there is a lawgiver behind the laws that we cannot deny exist, etc., and that is God Almighty, and to take a moment to see whether that can make a difference in your life.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I guess one question I would have is, so you even said yourself, like, it's the conditions that have, set Earth in motion, let's just say with humans, right? You said were like incredibly unlikely to the point of being improbable, but improbable is still like a tiny possibility. And if you say that time extends both ways infinitely, then it becomes a certainty that something like this will eventually happen, surely. Right?
So I like that point, except that, and I hear this a lot as well, that time does not pan out infinitely, because we know that time began at the inception of the Big Bang. So this universe that we have, this is what we have to go off of when we investigate things, started 13.8 billion years ago. That means we have a finite amount of time. And we know that one of the most fundamental truisms of physics is entropy, which demands, for example, entropy was... its value was about 10 to the power of 88 soon after the Big Bang. Now it's 10 to the power of like 123 or 5. So at quadrillions of times, about a quadrillion times, the entropy has increased. It never decreases.
Sure.
So the Earth, the universe will come to an end. So this idea of infinite time is improbable and impossible from a physics perspective, and then from a rational perspective, because if there was an infinite amount of time, then we would not be having this conversation, because we would have fizzled out of existence an infinite time ago.
Yes.
You see what I mean? And this is something that Professor Paul Davies, a leading physicist, has written in his own book.
So when you say time, are you talking about the almost physical concept of time rather than like, time on a clock? I know they're kind of entwined, but well, what I mean is like less strictly speaking about time, but if you ascribe to the theory...
I guess the events, the series of events.
Sure, yeah. So like if you subscribe to the theory that... So time is connected to our universe, you have space-time, it's a physical thing, but if you go essentially before the Big Bang and you ascribe to the Big Crunch theory in that it's kind of a repeating over and over like Big Bang, then at some point over that infinite stretch, you would have something like this occurring, basically, and it would just repeat in cycles.
So two things. I really like that. Firstly, when we talk about the Big Crunch, which, by the way, for our viewers, please correct me if I'm wrong, is basically the theory, by and large, that says that, look, universes keep coming in and out of existence. Yeah. This was made quite famous by Richard Dawkins as well some years ago, and my response to this is that Islam responds to this directly. If we're willing to propose an infinity, in terms of the succession of events, then why are we not willing to accept an infinite being? Because if you come in the contingency of events to an infinite prime cause, an infinity doesn't have a beginning, therefore you don't ask about that beginning. That is what Islam says. The second thing that's interesting particularly about Islam is that it actually propounded the Big Crunch theory in unambiguous terms 1400 years ago. And it says that just as we created this universe the first time, we will roll it up like the rolling of scrolls, and then as we created the first time, we'll create again. Because if God is eternal, then his attributes are eternal. He's not just going to create one time and that's it. Sure. So it has no issue with this proposition. What it does say is that no, eventually we have to concede that there is a prime initial cause, the beginning of events, because there's no evidence to purport that everything always just was.
Yeah.
Right? We're saying that beginning was creative, intelligent, and that's God, and that's a God worth knowing.
Yeah. Basically, I wouldn't take issue with any of that, and I would say that that is one possible explanation for sure, and I wouldn't discount it.
I would say this is the most probable explanation from every branch of science.
Yeah, no, fair enough. That's something that I just don't know that much about. I wouldn't God as one explanation isn't something I would shun, but I also wouldn't shun any other explanation. I would explore the possibilities.
We're the Existence Project, so we want to hear all the explanations, and if there's a best explanation, we want to know it. That's it. That's why we're here.
You want me to prove that God doesn't exist,
yes.
Okay, but I'm saying nobody can prove that, because you can't prove a negative.
So I'll tell you the three things that are wrong with this statement that you're making. Number one,